August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m. A radio message from Hiroshima is being decrypted at the headquarters of the Japanese High Command in Tokyo. The communications officer reads the text twice in disbelief, then a third time. His hands are shaking as he delivers the message to General Yoshijiro Umezu, Chief of the General Staff. The city has been destroyed. One bomb, tens of thousands of dead. It is impossible to estimate the scale of the destruction. There is silence in the room. During the 4 years of the war, the Japanese military leadership got used to reports of defeats, but always found explanations: insufficient morale, tactical mistakes, bad luck. You could always blame specific commanders, the weather, and randomness. But this message destroyed all the usual frames of thought. One city, one bomb, 3 planes. Meteorological intelligence confirmed that only 3 B-29s had actually flown over Hiroshima. Not hundreds, as with the usual carpet bombing. 3. Admiral Soemu Toyoda says what everyone is thinking: 3 planes cannot destroy a city. It's physically impossible, but the city is destroyed. And at that moment, the most painful epiphany in the history of the Japanese military command begins: the realization that they had been fighting for 4 years with an enemy they had never understood. General Koretiko Nami, the Minister of War and one of the most influential supporters of continuing the war to the last Japanese, is the first to voice what he desperately wants to believe: American propaganda. An exaggeration, perhaps a successful hit in an ammunition depot. But the evidence keeps coming. A railroad employee who survived the bombing on the outskirts of the city transmits a blood-curdling description through a military connection: a flash brighter than 1,000 suns. The explosion threw the trains off the rails 15 kilometers from the center. The city center just disappeared. In its place is a firestorm rising into the sky. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, one of the few in the top leadership who secretly sought ways to negotiate peace, understands the significance of what is happening before others. At an emergency meeting of the Supreme Military Council, he says, "Gentlemen, we must admit the obvious. This is not an ordinary weapon. The Americans have gained access to a force that we can neither understand nor counter." Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, a 77-year-old retired admiral, calls for a sober assessment of the situation. But most generals and admirals are still not ready to accept reality. Their worldview, built on the foundation of the spiritual superiority of the Japanese soldier over the materialistic West, does not allow such a development of events. Intelligence report, figures that cannot be ignored. Colonel Hideaki Sato, head of the Analytical Department of Military Intelligence, is ordered to prepare an urgent report on U.S. industrial capabilities. What he presents the next day becomes the most painful document in the history of the Japanese military command. In 1944, the United States produced 96,318 military aircraft. Japan, 28,180. America built aircraft carriers faster than we produced fighter jets to protect them. One Essex-class aircraft carrier came off the stocks every 2 months. It took us 2 years to build one. The numbers continue to roll in, each one like a blow. The United States has produced 17.3 million tons of merchant marine. We sank 8.9 million tons. They ended the war with a larger merchant fleet than they had at the beginning. We started the war with 6 million tons, now we have less than 1 million left. But the real shock comes when Sato turns to scientific possibilities. More than 130,000 scientists and engineers work in American research centers. Our universities have fewer physics departments than the Massachusetts Institute of Technology alone. The Manhattan Project cost them $2 billion, which exceeds our entire 1944 military budget. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Togo is asking a question that torments everyone: how could we not know about this? Sato's answer is ruthlessly honest: we knew, Mr. Minister. Our intelligence offices in America regularly reported on industrial expansion, about new plants, production facilities, and scientific programs. But their reports were systematically dismissed as exaggerations and enemy misinformation. We believed in what we wanted to believe in: the illusion of spiritual superiority. Since the end of the 19th century, Japanese military doctrine has been based on 3 pillars: geographical distance as protection, the moral and spiritual superiority of the Japanese soldier, and tactical innovations that compensate for the material gap. This doctrine worked well against Tsarist Russia in 1905 and against disparate Chinese armies in the 1930s. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, was one of the few who understood reality. In 1941, he warned, "I can win for 6 months, maybe a year. After that, I have no expectations of success." He knew America, he studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington. He saw the industrial power of the United States with his own eyes. But his warnings were ignored. The military caste that dominated Japanese politics believed in its own mythology. One Japanese soldier is worth 10 American soldiers. This was not propaganda for the masses, it was the sincere faith of the military leadership. The Battle of Midway in June 1942, where Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers and an elite naval aviation force, was supposed to be a sobering signal. But an official investigation pointed to bad luck and tactical errors by individual commanders. No one wanted to admit that the Americans had cracked the Japanese codes and knew about the plans in advance. On Guadalcanal, the Japanese command discovered that the Americans were capable of supporting large-scale operations thousands of kilometers from their bases. But local commanders were accused of insufficient morale. When Japanese submarines began to die en masse from American anti-submarine systems, it was blamed on unfavorable conditions. Every defeat was explained by anything but the simple truth: the enemy surpassed Japan in industrial power, scientific and technical capabilities, and logistics. And the atomic bomb destroyed the last illusions. It was not just a weapon, it was a tangible proof that the United States exists on a different technological and scientific level. Admiral Toyoda puts it in his diary, "We thought we were fighting an enemy that was richer in resources but at the same level of development." Hiroshima showed that the Americans had reached a qualitatively new stage. It's like samurai with swords facing an army armed with rifles. Bravery and fighting spirit don't matter in the face of such a gap in capabilities. When the reconnaissance plane transmitted photos of Hiroshima, the military council saw what seemed impossible. The city center, covering an area of several square kilometers, was completely wiped off the face of the earth. Not destroyed, but erased, turned into a flat, scorched desert. The buildings didn't just collapse, they evaporated. The stone has melted. The shadows of people are burned into the walls. The conventional bombing of Tokyo in March 1945, the most devastating up to that point, required 279 B-29s to drop 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs. The result was terrifying: about 100,000 people died. But Hiroshima showed comparable destruction from a single bomb dropped by a single aircraft. Cabinet Secretary Hisatsune Sakamizu writes in his diary, "For 4 years we believed that materialistic Americans would not survive the victims of a protracted war, that their morals would break. The atomic bomb showed the opposite. They created a weapon that requires the largest scientific project in the history of mankind, the mobilization of tens of thousands of the best minds, and the construction of entire cities for scientific centers. This is not the work of materialistic and weak people. This is the work of a nation with an iron will and incredible capabilities." The entry of the USSR, the collapse of the last hopes. August 9 brings another blow. The Soviet Union declares war on Japan. 1.5 million Soviet soldiers descend on Manchuria, where the Kwantung Army is stationed, an elite unit that the Japanese command considered invincible. In 11 days, this invincible army ceases to exist as a combat unit. Soviet tank columns cover distances in a day, which the Japanese staff considered insurmountable in a week. The coordination between aviation, artillery, and tanks is so far beyond Japanese capabilities that field commanders simply do not understand how to counter such a machine. For the Japanese command, this becomes another humiliating lesson. Even the USSR, which they considered technologically backward, demonstrates military capabilities an order of magnitude higher than the Japanese. Togo's foreign minister formulates a new reality: we have no more options. We hope to use the USSR as a mediator for negotiations on an honorable peace. Now we are surrounded by enemies from all sides. America is burning our cities with bombs that we can't even understand. The USSR is crushing our best army. The choice is simple: unconditional surrender now, or we will fight until the Americans drop 20 more atomic bombs on our cities. Nagasaki, the final epiphany. On August 9, 3 days after Hiroshima, the second atomic bomb destroys Nagasaki. For the Japanese command, this message reads very clearly: the Americans have more than one bomb. They have a production facility. They can make them in series. Admiral Mitsumasa Yenai, the Minister of the Navy, says a phrase that sums up the whole realization: the Americans have turned the most destructive weapon in history into a mass-produced product. We didn't just lose this war. We lost it the moment we started because we never realized who we were fighting. The Supreme Military Council is splitting up. General Anami and other hardliners are still pushing for continued resistance. But their arguments are no longer based on the chances of victory. They talk about honor, about the impossibility of accepting the dishonor of surrender, about the willingness to die, but not to surrender. The psychological transformation of the Japanese High Command is completed by August 15, when Emperor Hirohito personally decides on surrender and addresses the nation on the radio. For the military caste, which for centuries considered itself the embodiment of the Japanese spirit, this is the moment of the complete collapse of the worldview. September 2, 1945. Tokyo Bay, the deck of the battleship Missouri. A Japanese delegation led by Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Umezu is boarding to sign the Act of Unconditional Surrender. What they see becomes the final lesson. There are dozens of American warships in the bay, battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, and destroyers. Hundreds of planes pass overhead in a continuous stream, a demonstration of power that does not need words. Shigemitsu writes in his diary, "Every ship, every plane, every soldier on deck is evidence of industrial power, which we refuse to recognize. They brought us here on their transport because we no longer have ships capable of crossing the bay. They fed us American rations on the way because we don't even have enough food for the delegation." The humiliation of surrender pales before the humiliation of realizing how blind we were. The American Occupation Administration is doing a strange thing. They provide Japanese officials and the military with full access to statistics on American military production. Colonel Sato is preparing a report for the Imperial Court. During the war years, the United States produced 300,000 military aircraft, Japan 76,000. 86,000 tanks, Japan 6.5 thousand. 193 aircraft carriers of all types, Japan 29. 71 million tons of merchant fleet, Japan 4 million. At the same time, the production of civilian cars in the United States decreased by only 70% and was not completely stopped, as in our country. American civilians continued to buy refrigerators, radios, and household appliances, goods whose production in Japan ceased in 1942. One American infantry division had more trucks than the entire Imperial Army. Their supply units delivered fresh meat, vegetables, and ice cream to soldiers at the front. Our soldiers were starving to death on Guadalcanal, not because the Americans cut the supply lines, but because those lines never existed. We couldn't provide logistics over such distances. The most humiliating discovery is the details of the Manhattan Project. Japanese scientists learned that the project cost $2 billion and required the construction of entire scientific cities. The complex in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, consumed more electricity than the whole of Japan. The best physicists in the world worked in Los Alamos, New Mexico, many of whom were refugees from Europe, another proof of how the democracy and openness of the United States made it possible to attract talent from all over the world. "We believed," writes Sato, "that the spiritual strength of the Japanese soldier compensated for the material superiority of the enemy. The atomic bomb showed the absurdity of this belief. It is impossible to defeat the spirit of an opponent who can mobilize the resources of an entire continent, gather the best minds of mankind, and create weapons using the power dormant in the atom. We didn't lose this war on the battlefields. We lost it in university laboratories, on industrial assembly lines, in research centers we didn't even know existed." The psychological impact on the Japanese military leadership was different. General Anami committed ritual suicide the night after the announcement of the surrender. For him, the admission of defeat was unbearable. Several hundred officers followed his example, but most have gone through a painful transformation of their worldview. Admiral Yanai became one of the architects of post-war pacifist Japan, arguing that militarism led the nation to a dead end because it was based on illusions of its own superiority and misunderstanding of the modern world. Colonel Sato writes in his post-war memoirs, "The most terrible thing was not the military defeat. The scariest thing was the realization that for 4 years we had been killing our own soldiers, sending them into senseless attacks against an enemy whose might they refused to recognize. Everyone who died on Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa did not die because the Americans were stronger. He died because we, his commanders, were blind to reality." Friends, subscribe to the channel, put likes and write comments until new meetings.